is very good that we were able to bring Todd finally. For many years I've actually wanted to bring him to speak about the Hypercities project, and it finally worked out this year. He spearheaded, I mean, he's quite a force behind the Digital and Humanities Initiatives at UCLA, and he spearheaded a major MacArthur grant project with Catherine Hales, collaborative with Catherine Hales. You did most of the work.
Which one is this?
Oh yeah, see there you go. Which one is this?
Kate did most of the work on the
right.
seminar.
Yeah. So we could learn a lot from him, actually. But just officially, he's Associate Professor of Germanic Languages, Comparative Literature, and Jewish Studies. And his research generally focuses on European intellectual history, the history of media, visual culture, and cultural geography. Just his two, I guess I want to put traditional in quotation marks, but traditional books include Mobile Modernity, Germans, Jews, and Trains, which maps, this first book maps German-Jewish intellectual history onto the development of the railway system, and it articulates a concept of modernity in terms of the history of mobility. His second book, Muscular Judaism, The Jewish Body and the Politics of Regeneration, begins from Michel Foucault's concept of biopower to analyze issues of masculinity and discipline in relation to the strong or muscular Jewish body. Wide-ranging in scope, this study touches upon colonial discourse, eugenics, and the gymnastics movement in 19th century Germany. But he's here today to speak to us about Hypercities, which began as Hypermedia Berlin, I think. And I won't say anything about the project because he's going to give us, I think, an account of its development. So please join me in welcoming Todd Presner.
Great. Well, thanks so much Rita. Thank you so much for pursuing the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. And what I think I'll do is I'm going to speak maybe about a half hour to 40 minutes or so about the genesis of the project and try to place it within an intellectual, historical, media history lineage, which is where the project came from. And talk to you then and sort of end with some of the challenges that a Web 2.0 application presents, especially vis-a-vis the development, I think, of digital humanities programs in general, but also digital humanities scholarship. And I'll try to give you some examples of how this has played out in the Hypercities project. Like Rita said, the project actually goes back almost a decade now in terms of its beginnings. And in fact, I think it's somewhat instructive and interesting to think about digital humanities projects, especially over the last decade, because they often parallel the development of institutions and disciplinary formations, ones that I think are still in some ways emerging. And I think the Hypercities project is one that kind of betrays this other institutional history at the same time that the project has its own history. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. Then I'll take you through the project. This is all live, by the way, so if there's hiccups and things that fail, please blame me as much as you need to, because I am presenting it live. But hopefully it'll be fine. I think it will. I just told the team not to go back anything up right now, despite the fact that they claim there's a problem. Good. So like we just said, I'm at UCLA. I'm housed in the humanities. I'm in a German department and comparative literature program. I also one of the spearhead people behind our digital humanities and media studies initiative at UCLA. The program I think that you were talking about was our Mellon-sponsored media technology history series of seminars that we had. Yeah, so Hypercities is a project which actually, I'll just start with the etymology of the term, is actually a nod towards media theorist Ted Nelson, who you probably know, you probably read. He's the guy who in 1965 coined the term hypermedia. He also coined the term hypertext, and another term that he used, hyperfilm. Didn't really take off that much, hyperfilm, but certainly hypermedia and hypertext are very important. This is a reflection on what he called an evolutionary file structure. You may have read this. It's anthologized, in fact, in the New Media Reader. And what's interesting about the definition of hypertext or hypermedia for him is that, one, it's an extension in a kind of McLuhan sense of what media can do, an extension of. But it's also something that cannot be reduced to a single medium. And that's also important, that it can't be displayed on a single medium. For him, that medium was paper. And the extensibility here is not just that it carries out our perceptual, it extends our perceptual faculties, but it also extends the way in which information is related to each other, the ways in which we think of connections, its iterativeness, its processual elements, the fact that things can be added to it, all of this, the fact that it was participatory. All this was articulated in 1965. Hypercities is in many ways an extension of that term, and it's an extension of city spaces. That is to say, it's information networks, it's participatory, it's open-ended. It's meant to take what we know about the physical geography of a place and realize that buried within any given place are all these other voices, histories, stories, events, some of which are visible and some of which are not. The issue about invisibility is absolutely critical, and in many ways speaks to the fact that the project began in my own kind of flaneur-like reflections in Berlin. So I was in, and I tell you the story not because it's a story of a personal story, but because Berlin is actually central for the way in which the project was conceived. I articulate a little bit this in a piece that I published in Vectors back in 2005, which is called Hypermedia Berlin. And what's interesting about this is that Berlin as a city, and there are other cities that certainly betray this. I don't think Berlin is by any means unique. But you had many different simultaneously existing histories that didn't all match up with the present. That is to say, you could walk down the street and, like Benjamin's flaneur, be conducted downward in time. And that's the way in the Arcades project, in Convolute M of the Arcades project, Benjamin articulates the flaneur. The flaneur, of course, for him is often a figure he associates with Baudelaire, a figure associated with Poe. Often Paris and London are the sites for the flaneur. It's often masculine. It's a kind of, I think, at least historically, I think there's a certain kind of male gaze associated with it that needs to be unpacked and problematized. But in thinking about Berlin, Benjamin, in fact, doesn't think that Berlin is actually a place for a flaneur. He doesn't think that Berlin, at least in the modern period, well, for him, 19th century was the epitome of sort of modernity, so that's why Paris was, of course, the capital of modernity, or London. But Berlin wasn't satisfactory. It wasn't as industrial. It wasn't as advanced. It wasn't able to contain those things that Benjamin associated with modernity. And that might have been, I mean, one thing certainly was mobility. Another thing was the convergence of many different forces that brought about a different stage brought about industrial capitalism. But what Berlin does have, and this is something that Benjamin couldn't have possibly have known because he didn't live long enough. He killed himself, as you know, in 1940 trying to escape fascist-occupied France. What he doesn't know are the series of histories that came to occupy Berlin in the years that followed. So not just the history of Prussian Berlin, followed by Nazi Berlin, followed by divided Berlin, followed by reunited Berlin, followed by EU kind of driven Berlin. You have all these different simultaneous histories built in. And as I was there, thinking about Benjamin and the flaneur being conducted downward in time, I was also thinking about Bloch and the very famous, the kind of idea of the many simultaneously existing but non-simultaneous histories, right? Ungleichzeitigkeit. It's a fascinating term in German because it means, I mean, literally it means non-same time. And that's important, non-same-timedness. And yet, you're always there existing, something's existing in time. You're seeing it because, I mean, certainly when you're there in a time, I mean, you're not existing in many different times. You're in one time, but yet the things don't line up. And so you can imagine kind of coring down and trying to see all these stratified layers. So this Ungleichzeitigkeit, the non-timedness is important. The flaneur is important. The history of Benjamin is important. And then finally, the other thing that's important, and this goes to the German term for history itself, Geschichte, it already contains a spatial component, meaning a Schicht. So if you have an idea of a Schicht or Schichten, in German these are layers. They can refer to class strata, like class layers. They can refer to differences in economic or social privilege, but they can also refer to sediment layers, almost like archaeological or geological layers. So I began thinking in terms of Zeitschichten. So I put these two terms together, time layers, right? The idea that in any given space you have multiple time layers. And these multiple time layers are not always legible. And again, this is a very Benjaminian, I'm presenting all this background before I even show you the project, because the project is immensely Benjaminian. If you haven't read Benjamin or you haven't, yeah, I don't think you can understand where this project came from without Benjamin. And in many ways, I could even go so far as to say the project is trying to instantiate the Arcades project in the 21st century.